Hello everyone, this is a status update on my final project for the ICTD course. In my 1 minute pitch I said I would be critiquing the OLPC project, and I'm going to let you know how that's going or if I'm even still doing that. So as context, I did also do my book report on the Charisma machine, which is an internal history of the project along with many other things, a meta-analysis of the success of the project. And I think the core thesis that Morgan puts forward that I agree with is that ICTD has a stalemate of hype versus hopelessness. I'm paraphrasing, and that stalemate needs to be broken. I agree with that. My analysis is a little bit more basic, which has to do with the idea. My idea is that the hype that's being critiqued in a lot of these projects is actually not relevant to academic research and formal research because it's reacting to, instead of formal things, it's reacting to, and the formal scope of the project, it's reacting to the last 30, 40 years of personal computing, marketing and advertising. So, sort of as an analogy to this, I want to show a piece of content from a product that's not technology.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh boy. Houston, we have a problem.
Oh, jeez. You drank a Red Bull. Red Bull gives you wings.
What should we do?
Well, nothing. Come back to Earth and we'll shoot the whole thing in a studio.
Okay.
So, an adjacent example from technology of hype would be.
This morning, Brian Scott made a career decision. He decided to be an astronaut. His first giant step, learning to use an Apple. There are more Apple IIs teaching more
So, my core point is I don't think anyone thought that buying an Apple II was definitely going to get their kids to become astronauts. And, this commercial is a little bit self aware too. It makes a joke about the kid changes his mind by the end of what he wants to do, become a marine biologist. But my overall point is statements from like Toyama, like tech doesn't make kids smarter. I think he's done some legitimate research in his career, but from a media literacy standpoint, just like a basic, like, does the headline match the content? This says tech doesn't make kids smarter, but the first 5 minutes of the video is all about, oh, the Arab Spring didn't work because phones aren't sufficient in protests, and if that was the case, we should call the American Revolution the Lantern Revolution. I don't. I think that this is like a little bit nonsensical, and I don't want to diminish the positive things that he's done in his research, but I in the same, I think, as an analogy, it would be as if people were spending 10 years of formal research saying that Red Bull doesn't give you wings. I think most people, and at least in the developed world and academia, know that marketing and advertising is hyperbolic. It's overstated. I don't think that anyone was expecting anything more than an energy drink with and this is pretty common. It's the KFC secret spices, whatever you want to do. So I think to make an accurate critique of OLPC, we have to, in ICTD in general, start thinking of more realistic ways of interpreting what a project is likely to do in its scope, not just based on even its formal scope, but maybe from the outset tamping down those expectations if you're going to do an analysis. So, one laptop per child. I know that they said that that basically means one for everyone on the planet, but I think most people could have inferred that there would be a series of pilot projects, and that ultimately the people that funded it, people like Google, would take that research and use it for their own ends, like promoting it, the concepts from it, taking the concepts from it, and making something like the Chromebooks, And this explains kind of why Microsoft is so against in their research these kind of ideas of giving an open source laptop in schools that would be funded by Google, because ultimately they just don't want to lose market share. And other examples of that is like in Geek Heresy, the cover of the book is busting open an Android phone. So it is what it is. But where can we go from here? And I think where we can go from here is borrowing some ideas from startups, ideas of proof of concept and minimum viable product, which is about customer development.
How did you get your start in music?
Man, I gotta say, like I was rapping since third grade. I used to listen to Run DMC and LL and be in the crib and sneaking and listen to the rap with the bad words and Easy E and Beastie Boys and all that. And then I remember when they brought out Yamahas and Casio keyboards, it was real in style. But the thing is, I had like an urge to really create, but I never wanted to really learn how to play music like that. So it was like, that was stagnating my growth because my mother was always like, well, if you can't play, you don't need the type of keyboard that can sequence and all that type of shit. So once I was like in seventh grade, I was like really into drawing and I wanted to like design video games. So I got this Amiga computer, which is a really good price for all that it did. It was $500 and it had like all type of graphic program and everything. Yeah, so when those keyboards came out, or I had my computer and I was trying to draw on it, and then I got a sound program, like somebody bootlegged the copy of the disc with me, or the sound program. I found myself just wanting to work on that all the time. Then I found myself like running home from school because I have an idea, like looking at the clock, looking at 2:30, like, yo, man, I want to get this beat down. But I didn't even know anything about sampling. And I was 14 years old. I went to Chuck Levin's out in Maryland, and they told me, people that do the type of music you do, they sample. I had no idea. I was just be trying to, I didn't know why my stuff didn't sound exactly like the stuff on the radio. But the sampler was like, $2,000. And for somebody that's 14 years old only getting the allowance, that was like $8 million. My father's like, maybe you could save your allowance. I had like $20 a week. Like, how am I gonna save up for $2,000? So I'm just working with that. Then I found out you can get like a little 8-bit sampler for the computer. So I got that. And of course, the first thing I wanted to sample was James Brown. So I think back then I used to try to make beats like Full Force. And, in the middle of the song, you had to have a go where you could like really start doing your running man real hard too. So I started making beats and my beats started getting nice. And then my mother came home one day and she was like, you ever heard of Common Sense? I was like, yeah, I heard Common Sense. He got a song called Take It Easy on the radio right now. He cold, right? He's like, well, I know a friend of mine said her son produces for him. I was like, oh, word?
So basically, I just wanted to play that clip as an example of someone who's basically saying that one of these computers from the late 80s to the early 90s with a constructivist tool at its price point was key to their entire career, and that essentially he's saying it wouldn't have been possible without it. I think it is quite possible that if Kanye never got the Amiga and the 8-bit sampler, that he would never have made nearly as much of his early works that got him to eventually become a professional producer, and then obviously a world famous pop musician. So I just give that as a basic counter example to the idea that technology can't to the idea that technology is not influential and almost self can allow the student to teach themselves something. Clearly it can, or clearly at least some people feel that it can directly themselves.
Microsoft had pledged to offer its operating system to the project. And while Linux won out, some wider-ranging effects were still had. The company's experience with the
So my critique of the all PC project and the XL laptop really stems from the fact that even though I sympathize with a lot of the goals and the ideas behind it. I find them interesting and useful. The core issue was that a lot of it was inspired based on people's experience and beliefs about personal computers pre-internet, and the experiment when they gave the kids the laptop was with the internet, and essentially that creates a totally different product where you're not by default disconnected from a television and therefore drawn into a drawing program, a paint program, a music making program, or any sort of constructivist tool. I don't agree that these tools don't work. I think that there's a wide variety of scenarios where they do work and are necessary going forward for a lot of people, even in the developing world, to have access to. I just think that the project itself under considered how much the internet as a factor in these kind of computers would be versus the computers from 15 years, 20 years before, which shipped without networking equipment usually. And these type of computers would include the Apple IIe, the Commodore 64, the Commodore Amiga, which is much more similar to the Macintosh, and just the entire sort of 1990s multimedia PC, Windows PC phenomenon, prior to Windows 95, which is really where the internet kicked off. That entire era was what a lot of OLPC, I think, was inspired by, where these things really could have been looked at as purely a creative tool or a word processing tool, a paint programming tool. But once you added the internet to a personal computer, it also became a television. So, of course, it was full of distracting content potentially, and I just think that there wasn't a lot of thought put into, well, maybe we start the project with sending it out without the internet, see what happens. Um, so I just wanted to play that clip. That even though I like the woman in the video, Ash, I am literally not a communist, but I do think that was an interesting interaction, and I wanted to play it before I play my next clip by a Marxian economist who I do find interesting.
What then in the world is to be done? And I will conclude with comments on that. I'd like to use a metaphor drawn from farming, an activity I know many of you spend much time in. If you have a farm, it's possible that you also have a large building known as a barn. A barn is a very useful structure. It allows you to store wood and hay and keep your animals. It's vital for many, many farms to have a barn. And people who have farms get attached to their barns in all kinds of emotional and spiritual ways, given the importance of the structure and the time spent in it. So when a barn begins to tilt, when a barn begins to leak, when a barn begins to have many of its problems, there is an understandable effort to repair it, to fix it, to patch it up, to replace a windowsill, to all the rest. You keep doing that, and it takes more time and more labor as more and more of the barn begins to break down. At a certain point, an intelligent farmer and or her spouse says, listen, the amount of time and money that we are spending and the amount of losses we are suffering from a barn that has done its useful thing, has served us magnificently. But there comes a time when you have to say, look, there are nowadays radically new ways of constructing barns. Let's take this one down, save a few pieces and hang them on the wall so we remember, and build a new barn from the ground up. Okay? Try to keep this metaphor in your head as I go through my conclusion. We live in a kind of economic system, very particular kind. It's called capitalism. It's been around for a few hundred years, like a really good barn, and has served us well, like a really good barn. It is not working real well anymore. It has broken down globally twice in 75 years, and it is driving gaps between rich and poor, both across countries and inside countries, on a scale that ought to have any reasonable person terrified. It is producing anger and rage and violence that go with extremes of wealth and poverty that coexist close to one another, which modern technology means everybody. We all watch each other on television or on YouTube or on Facebook or wherever. We, however, live in a country, more here in the United States than anywhere else in the world, which has as a legacy of a long and difficult Cold War an aversion, a fear, and a disinclination to ask the question, is capitalism the best way for us to organize the economic dimensions of our lives? We are the only country that does not have significant, large mass movements of people who answer that question, no, we can do better than capitalism. They mean different things by it, but that discussion, that issue is on the table in those societies, and more so today than it has been in a long time. It's on the lips of most of the people in the streets of Europe over the last 24 hours. We're afraid of that here. It's associated with scary prospects and a Cold War that is far from over in terms of its lingering effects. And I think that is something we have to begin seriously to think about. I think that's the lesson of this crisis that we dare not learn. Let me tell you what I mean. Are there alternatives to capitalist arrangements? Yes. But they're not the alternatives you may have thought about. In our society, as a legacy of the Cold War, when the issue even came up a little bit, it was always couched in the same terms. And I don't think these are the useful terms. And the terms I mean are this: more government or less government. Capitalism is somehow understood as less government, whereas socialism, communism, and those are more government. Or private enterprise, government enterprise, or private market transactions versus government planning. You notice the dichotomy, more government, less government. Very strange argument. If you do any real concrete research, it dissolves on you. It doesn't make any sense. And let me give you why. The United States has been dependent on the government. Our economy is wrapped up with the government and has been from the day we were born as a nation. This notion that the government should be kept out of the economy, that's crazy. That's crazy. That's never been true, never been close. All of you have in your pockets, if you're lucky, this green stuff. Money. Most of you believe, more or less, that money makes the world go round. The money is a government monopoly. We did have early in our history a situation where we allowed others, private people, to make money. That was so chaotic, we forbade that a long time ago. So money, kind of crucial in our economy when you think about it, is a governmental activity. And so are thousands of other things. And in case you haven't had the time to do it, if you ever study the history of the Soviet Union, they never did without markets. Markets were everywhere in the Soviet Union, as they are in China, and as they always have been. An economy without markets? That, not at all. Or here's another one, private property.
So I bring this video in as context to say that, in ICTD, there's often it seems to me, perspective that, capitalism doesn't work, or it does work in the startup world. Either way, like, regardless of any given individual or institution's take on what the ideal economic system is, or the ideal economic reforms, the idea that markets are synonymous with capitalism and that markets are bad is actually an absurd premise. Um, and in that sense, the idea that NGOs are the good guys or the good people because they're not for profit, and that market oriented entities, corporations, are inherently the bad guys doesn't make sense because in virtually any economic system that you could think of, markets will exist and will be regulated. And so, to that end, even if one is not a capitalist, even if one does not subscribe to thinking capitalism is good, if one seeks to do a project with technology that is effective, it makes sense to look at the literature where markets are employed to in ways that are considered effective relative to the domain. So one doesn't have to be a capitalist or subscribe to the ideas to extract ideas from things like the lean startup method, which is typically framed as a way of starting a for-profit company. But I would challenge that the methods in here could only be that I would challenge the idea that the methods in here are only relevant to for-profit corporations, because any project that exists in markets needs some kind of enterprising spirit to it. Just to look at some definitions here, technology. This is from Oxford Dictionaries for English, American English or British English, say early 17th century, from the Greek, meaning systematic treatment, or from techne, art or craft. So I sort of reject this idea that technology is this weird concept. It's things that we make. We're employing the scientific method to find useful goods, basically. Things that we can, our arts and crafts, our outputs of that. And when it comes to entrepreneurship, that word is normally associated with capitalism and for profit. But if you look in terms of enterprise, a project or undertaking, typically that one that is difficult or requires effort, it comes from the Middle English, something undertaken, entrepreneur, whatever this is, to take. So basically, what I'm saying is, even if one is a socialist or a communist, almost certainly markets will be involved, and to get anything done, you have to have some ability to take on that enterprise. And I believe that you can extract from things like the lean startup methods that could apply in an NGO context, in a research context. The current Treasury Secretary for the United States, Janet Yellen, is also a professor emeritus of business administration at Berkeley Haas, and she's also former Federal Reserve Chair for the United States. Recently made some comments that I think are key to understanding that there is a paradigm shift in ICTD, and if you take the D to mean economic development. And I'm going to play it and then respond to what she said.
Digital services has opened up a world of possibilities and risks that would have seemed fantastical only a few decades ago. Financial services, along with most industries, have evolved in response to exponential advances in computing power and connectivity. Most recently, new technology has raised the possibility of reduced reliance on centralized intermediaries like banks and credit card companies. In 2008, a person or group of people using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto proposed a decentralized peer-to-peer system for making and processing payments. A key challenge in digital payments is to prevent the same assets from being spent twice. The Bitcoin white paper proposed a novel method for validating transactions using cryptography that address the so-called double spend problem. This and other innovations related to distributed ledger technology are the foundation for blockchain-based digital assets.
So I bring this video up because I think ICTD is at a crossroads and entering a new paradigm that must be acknowledged in future research done in an academic or formal way. If we have the present Treasury Secretary acknowledging Satoshi Nakamoto, we're fundamentally in a new era of economic development than we were 10 years ago, than we were 20 years ago. This kind of innovation and acknowledgement of it, I think it would be absurd to interpret it as a minor change in policy or understanding about the future of economics globally and therefore development globally.